Evening. This is November 30th, 2022. My name is Douglas Griffin. This is my Wednesday night Bible study. Excuse me. We're in the book of John. We've been going through the book of John for a while. We're in Matthew, now we're in John. Next we might be in Luke because Luke's very interesting. Uh, we're in John chapter 11. I want to catch us up on what's been going on. Actually, I can do that by just going to the actual scripture. I'm actually going to start from the end of John chapter 10. We are in the last 4 months now of the ministry of Jesus. He's been preaching for 3 years and 2 months approximately. In chapter 10, it was December. It was the Festival of Lights. We know it as Hanukkah, the Festival of Dedication. Jesus was speaking at it, and he upset a few people. He wasn't speaking at the festival or at the feast. But during this time, he was speaking, and some Pharisees had confronted him in Jerusalem. And Jesus did not like to be in Jerusalem because they were always trying to kill him. And there was a time when he was going to let them kill him, but this was not the time. And he just faced great opposition, and it was bad for the people who were listening and trying to get something out of it, for the Pharisees to always be attacking Jesus. But he knew that they needed to hear the gospel as well as anything else, so he was down there. In John chapter 10, he says to the Pharisees, verse 37, "If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me," which is fair, right? If you don't see me doing any miracles, don't believe what I have to say. But if I do, though you do not believe me, at least believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I'm in him. So if you see me opening blinded eyes and deaf ears and walking on water, then at least you got to acknowledge the works. And clearly God is working through me, and I'm working in him. Well, it says in verse 39, therefore they sought again to seize him, but he escaped out of their hands. Like, we're going to take him, we're going to execute him. They're ready to execute him right then. It just wasn't time. So he was able to escape out of their hands. It says, and he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place, I'm talking about the Jordan River, where they crossed over 700 years earlier, when actually 1,200 years earlier, when the Israelites first came over into Israel from Egypt. They crossed the Jordan, and the Jordan River, the place where they crossed, was in the very middle of Israel. God worked it out so they went in the middle so that he could send some north and send some south and send some east and some west. They were already west. So he goes back there where John had been baptizing in the beginning, it says. And there he stayed there for a while. And he's there actually for maybe a couple months. But he came down to Jerusalem in September, October for the Feast of Tabernacles, the Festival of Tabernacles, and stayed there through December. And he goes up north for a little while to preach again to people who are receptive. Do I preach to the people who are trying to kill me, or do I preach to the people who actually are going to believe and then get saved? I think I'll go to people who are waiting to hear the word, the Samaritans, the Galileans, because when they hear it, they'll respond with an open heart. And when I say to them, they just want to kill me, which is okay that they want to kill me, but no one's getting saved. So he goes up north to a place where John was baptizing the first. Remember in John chapter 1, verse 28, it says, these things were done in Bethbara. We would say Bethany. So this was the Bethany beyond the Jordan. There's the Bethany that's right next to Jerusalem, and there's the Bethany in central Israel called Bethany beyond the Jordan. So he's there for a while on purpose. God sends him there, and again, everything Jesus is doing, he's doing because the Spirit is leading him to do it. Jesus said a few times, there are many things that I would say to you, but I'm only going to say what the Spirit tells me to say. There are many things I would do, but I'm only going to do what God tells me to do, so he can be an example to us. So God has led him there. Jesus is not wandering there. He's not mad and God's leading him there because there's people there who need to get saved. So Jesus is there. Verse 42, It says, then many came to him and said, John performed no sign, but all the things that John spoke about this man were true. I mean, John didn't do any miracles, but John said, there's one coming after me, and he's going to do miracles, and this guy's doing miracles. It says, and many believed in him there. So new converts there. So he's not hiding out in central Israel. He's preaching the word, and people are getting saved. Now, John chapter 11, verse 1. So that was into John chapter 10, where we left off last week. Jesus is about to do his 7th miracle. John picks 7 specific miracles, numbers them. At least for a while he numbered them. He didn't get to number 7 and said, and this is the 7th, but there are 7 miracles that he does. The first was he changed water into the wine, and each miracle is demonstrating a quality about God that people did not quite comprehend. So he changes the water into wine. He basically is speeding up this process where the water eventually, these barrels were eventually going to get grapes put in them, and they go through this process, and the water would become wine. Jesus speeds it up. It makes it happen in an instant to show that God is the God of the passage of time. Things that we think is going to take, well, that's going to take 4 years to do. God can do it in an instant. They need to know that. The next was the healing of the officer from Capernaum, who Jesus is on his way to his house. This is in John chapter 4. This is number 2. And the guy says, you don't have to come all the way to my house. We're 10 miles from my house. You can stop right here, because I know that all you have to do is say a word and he can be healed. And so Jesus therefore did it to show that he's master of distance. We think, well, the preacher has to come to my house. And it's nice if the preacher can. It's nice if the person can come and lay hands at you, but they can pray over the phone, because God actually can be in 2 places at once. People didn't know that. Jesus, you don't have to come down to my house. You can just say a word right here, because God's everywhere at once. But we think, no, unless the person comes and touches me. Now, if God has spoken to you and said they must come and touch you, fine. But if somebody's not able to make it, pray with them over the phone. That's fun. God's showing us here. There's no such thing as distance as far as God is concerned. Third miracle, he heals the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda, who'd been in this condition for years and years, and whose mind had told him he was never going to get out of this condition. And he's showing this person that I'm the master of your doubt. Even when you don't believe, and if you're a skeptic, God can go past our fears. He can go past our doubts. We need to know that. Because sometimes we are taught, you must have perfect faith. It must be exactly perfect, and you must confess every day and everything. If you ever doubt for a second, then God's going to go, oh, sorry. Do that, And this man was arguing with Jesus. Jesus says, hey, do you want to be healed? Yeah, well, then get up. Okay, I'll do it, but I don't do it. And it worked. Number 4, he's showing that God is the feeding of the 5,000. This is in John chapter 6. And again, John picks 7 miracles over the 3.5 years because they each demonstrate a different quality. God is the master over quantity. We only have this much money, Jesus. We only have $10. How are we going to do that? We only have 5 fish and 7 loaves of bread. How are we going to do that? Right? There's only 5 of us. How are the 5 of us going to do that? And God says, I don't need anything. He's just saying, I just need you to be willing. Just be willing to put your $10 forth, or your 10 people, or whatever, your 10 loaves of bread. I'll multiply it. So I'm the master over the quality of things, over the quantity of things. I can turn water to wine. So I can turn 7 loaves of bread into 700, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th was Jesus walking on the water. Like, I'm master over nature. This is John chapter 6. Physics, thank you. Over physics. Well, that's impossible. Well, with God, there's nothing impossible. You don't have to worry about it. 12 of us can't fit in that car, whatever. We'll never make it up that hill because it's too heavy. If God says you can make it, then physics hasn't made anything to God, even though he invented them. Because he invented them, he can subvert them whenever he wants to. So if God's saying something in your ear to go do, he's master of all these things. Number 6 was healing the man born blind from birth. So he's a master of time in that, well, it's too late for that. He was born blind. That I'm going to create a new eye for this person. So I know how he was born, but that's nothing to me. I can create something out of nothing. So the seventh miracle is the one that in John's eye tops them all. The other three writers do not, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't include this miracle, which I think there's various reasons why. But he writes about it. The seventh miracle coming up in John chapter 11. So, beginning with John chapter 11, verse 1, it says, now a certain man was sick. The other three writers don't mention it for a couple reasons. John reveals that in John chapter 12. In verse 10, it says, the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also because on account of him, many of the Jews went away and believed in Jesus. So their family is in danger. If we can kill Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, then the miracle is gone. It didn't really exist. But as long as Lazarus is walking around, he's living proof that Jesus is master over death. And so we don't want people to believe that. So we'll kill Lazarus, and that'll end that. Ha! He's dead. So there. So and Mary and Martha are in trouble too. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they wrote their Gospels, Lazarus was still alive, and it's believed he lived another 30 years after this thing happened. So he's still alive, and their family is in danger. Their family went into hiding, and so that's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke did not include it in their Gospels. Although Mark had one extra reason, which I'll get to later. So he says, now a certain man was sick, and he's going to tell you who he was. Even though the other guys didn't mention him, I can mention him now because I'm writing this in 60 AD. And it's 60 years after the fact. And so he's passed away. It's safe to say it now. John chapter 11, verse 1, he says, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. This town, Bethany, which you'll also see, it'll say Bethpage sometimes, but it's the same town, Bethany, is very near, it's like 45-minute walk from there to Jerusalem. In Matthew 21, verse 1, it says, now when they drew near Jerusalem, they came to Bethpage at the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus sent two disciples to go and say, get a donkey for me and find a place for us to have communion. As you recall, during that very last week. It's Bethany is on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a series of mountains right east of Jerusalem, east of the temple. It's where Abraham sacrificed Isaac on those mountains. It's where Jesus was crucified, this Mount of Olive mountain range. Bethany is there, and a few other famous, and Garden of Gethsemane are all there, are all in different parts of this set of mountains that are, and they're not hills really. They're not huge mountains like we would think. But Bethany is like a 45-minute walk from Bethany to Jerusalem. Jesus went there a lot. In fact, in Matthew 21, verse 17, after Jesus had gone to the temple, it says, then he left there and went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. He would sleep in Bethany, then he'd come back. During that last week that Jesus was alive, his very final week, he'd come to Jerusalem, he'd go to the temple, yell at everybody, then he'd go home and go sleep to Bethany. Probably at Mary and Martha's house, possibly at Simon's house, Simon the former leper. I guess he's no longer a leper. But he's always sleeping in Bethany. He liked to go there. So in Luke chapter 10, it says, now it happened as they went, he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary. Jesus had gone there earlier to Bethany, and Luke had that story with him. I think Luke had that story. It says, now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house, and she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. So you remember this story you've heard where Martha is spending her time cooking and worrying about the guest, and Mary spending her time at Jesus' feet. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and he's calling it distracted because she should not have been worried about that. And she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore, tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things. But one thing is needed. There's only one thing that's necessary right now. So you need to quiet yourself and say, now, what's the more important thing? That I feed all these people that Jesus brought here, or that I listen to these words that might change my life? So, because is he coming? Is he going to be here forever? Or is this the last couple of weeks of his life? What should I be doing? But one thing is certain, Mary's chosen that good part which will not be taken away from her. So that's the Mary and Martha that we know of. There's one story in Mark chapter 14. I'm laughing because I'm trying to decide if I should include the story. In Mark chapter 14, verse 3, the night that Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's taken away, there's a guy who follows him. I'll talk about that next week. I'll worry about that next week. Anyway, so he's in Bethany, and he gets a message from Mary and Martha. Okay, John chapter 11, verse 2 says, it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. So I want you to know which Mary, because again, during Jesus' time, 1 out of every 3 women was named Mary. It was just a very popular name in Jerusalem, Mary. Like Tiffany was real popular in certain communities, or so, you know. So he has to tell you which Mary. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. This happened twice. Neither of the times was it Mary Magdalene. Neither of the times. There was one woman who had done it, and then Mary, Martha's sister, had done it. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 6 through 7, it says, and when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. So those are the 2 people that Jesus knew who lived in Bethany. Sometimes he'd be at Mary and Martha's house. Sometimes he'd be at Simon's house. He says, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head, and he sat at the table. Matthew never tells you who this woman was, because again, when Matthew wrote the gospel, Mary and Martha's lives were in danger. The Pharisees were seeking them to kill them and to kill their brother Lazarus, who was still alive when Matthew wrote it. So he just says a certain woman came in. John is saying it was that Mary who anointed that was the one. It was Martha's sister. Now that Lazarus is dead and he's no longer a threat, you know, I can say who Mary and Martha were because the Pharisees are no longer after them. John chapter 11, verse 3. Therefore, the sisters sent to Jesus, saying, now remember, Jesus is up in central Israel at Bethany beyond the Jordan, not at the Bethany that's right next to Jerusalem, in South Israel. And they sent to him, saying, Lord, behold, guess what? He whom you love is sick. Now, let's examine this statement. They've sent a messenger. He whom you love is sick. Yes, Jesus has gotten close to Lazarus, and they're letting him know that he's deathly ill, because a lot of people were sick, but they're letting him know he's deathly ill. They didn't ask for him to come there. They just needed him to know, because if he knows, he could just say in a word, right? Let's remind ourselves what everybody knew in John chapter 4, and even John had pointed this out. That's why John is not reminding you like I am, because John had already put it in his gospel, right? He says, the nobleman says to Jesus, Sir, come down before my child dies. So a nobleman has come to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, go your way, your son lives. So the man believed. Now this is there were 2 different ones. There was a guy from Capernaum who told Jesus, you don't have to come in my house. This nobleman that John is speaking of and referring to He didn't believe. He says, "Come on, hurry up," because Jesus was busy healing a bunch of other people. When you see this story in other places, Jesus healed this person and that person, and the nobleman had come to Jesus and said, "Come on to my house." Okay, Jesus is following the guy, but along the way, the woman issue of blood showed up, and another a woman whose son was sick, and all these people were stopping, and the nobleman is mad. So that's why he yells at Jesus and says, "Come down now before my child dies." But Jesus says to him, "Go your way, your son lives." So the guy doesn't know, do I go or do I say, "I'll wait for you," or do I just go? So the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way without Jesus. And as he was going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Hey, your son lives." So he inquired of them in the hour of when my son started to get better. And they said to him, "Yesterday, at exactly the seventh hour, the fever left him." Now, the day starts at 6 in the morning. So the seventh hour is 1 in the afternoon. Right at the seventh hour, 1 in the afternoon, the fever left him. So the father knew that it was at that same hour when Jesus said to him, "Your son lives." And he himself believed, and his whole household. Like when Jesus said it, that's when it happened. Everybody heard that. It was a nobleman's son. So this word went around, right? Just imagine somebody's famous, their child. The Lindbergh baby was kidnapped. Other babies were kidnapped during that time. Wasn't just the Lindbergh baby. That baby was famous. So we got all this press. This son was famous. His father's a nobleman. Everybody knows this. So when Mary and Martha send word, this person, he whom you love is sick. They want him to say a word right then, because he's at really the point of death. However, in John chapter 11, verse 4, it says, when Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death." This word, "not unto death," should have been translated, "This sickness is not death is not the final destination." That's the more accurate translation. Death is not the final thing that's going to happen. So he doesn't say he's not going to die. He says death is not the final state. That's not the purpose of the sickness. That's not the destination of the sickness. That's not what it's aimed at. He says, but it's for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. So the sickness that is happening, the purpose is not for us all to eventually just mourn. The purpose is for God to be glorified. That's what's going to happen in this case. He's not saying in every single case it ever happens from now on. That's why this scripture is descriptive and not prescriptive. It's not something you can take and just use in every situation. In this specific situation. And it's similar to his words when he spoke in John chapter 9 about the blind man. When they asked him about the blind, why was this blind man? Why was he born blind? Jesus answers in verse 3 and said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Because they're saying, well, who sinned? Which one sinned? Because that's the only reason why there's somebody going to be sick. That's not true. He says, in this case, there was no sin. That's not why this happened. And we want to blame everything on sin. That's not why this happened. It says, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. So there is some purpose, but here's what's ultimately that we don't know about. Jesus didn't go into all the purpose, but he said, here's what the end result will be, that the works of God's going to be revealed in him. So you don't have to always know the reason. God will let you know the reason if you need to know, but sometimes you don't need to know the reason something happens. Somebody says, hey, could you pray for so-and-so? She's in the hospital. Well, let me find out all the reasons why, and then I'll decide if I'm going to pray. You don't need to know all the reasons. Just pray, and God will let you know if, okay, here's what's the ultimate thing is victory. And so Jesus is saying a similar thing. This sickness, the ultimate thing is going to be God's going to be glorified. Now, Jesus loved Martha. Help me, Jesus. In verse 5, it says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. This sentence needs to be dissected. We know in John chapter 11, verse 39, that by the time Jesus does get there, he'd been dead for 4 days. So we know that 2 of the days, Jesus was just waiting around. And I believe, along with some scholars, that it took 2 days for Jesus to get there. It's a 30-mile, it was 30 miles from where Jesus was to Bethany. This messenger, young messenger traveling by themselves, they didn't send 80-year-old people out in these sort of things. They found some young kid, gave him a message, gave him a couple bucks. He might have run and gotten there in one day. It's 30 miles. Jesus is traveling with 70 or more people, and that 70 not includes his 12 disciples, and they have kids and they have people. So I believe that Jesus went 15 miles and stopped, and then 15 miles the second day and stopped. I don't believe that he had 70 people with their families running 30 miles to get there. So I believe it took one day for the guy to get there, but probably 2 days for Jesus to get there. So that's the 4 days. They said when Jesus did get there, it's been 4 days in John chapter 11, verse 39. Jesus said, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there was a stench, for he's been dead 4 days. So when the guy delivers the message, I believe that Lazarus was alive. And at that point, if Jesus had been moved by God to say something, saying a word, he could have healed him. But instead, Jesus waited 2 days. It traveled 2 days, and that's the 4 days. So once Jesus decided to wait, that's when this Lazarus was dead. So why not, if Lazarus is dead, why not just leave right then? What we know that in Jewish thinking at the time, the spirit still hovered around the body for 3 days, and he didn't want he wanted everybody to be clear that Lazarus was dead, for them not to brush it off. Well, he'd only been dead for 2 days, and that anybody can come back after 2 days. So he made sure, let me get there on the 4th day. So when this miracle happens, you can't dispute it. Been dead, way dead. He's stinking by now, Martha's saying, because it's been 4 days. So he waits that time. But again, if he's dead when Jesus begins the wait, not when the guy shows up, but after Jesus hears the news, Jesus could have waited 2 weeks. He could have waited any number of time. When they see Jesus loved Mary and Martha, so he only waited 2 days. The people in Judea are trying to kill Jesus. And so out of his love, he went there as soon as God would let him, if that makes any sense. But anybody else would say, why are you going back to Judea? He's dead and they're going to kill you. Well, which in fact is what his disciples said to him as we go forward. So in John chapter 2, verse 4, Jesus is letting us know there's a time for everything to happen. That's why Jesus didn't say, he's waiting for God to give him the word. We've got to learn there's a time. We think as soon as we hear the news, we've got to move into action. And a lot of times that's true, probably. But sometimes God may have you wait and you don't know why you're waiting. You'll get news. Hey, I need you to come right now. Or I need this, and you're thinking, oh, I should go. But I don't know. I just slowed down for some reason. I had to do these other things first. And you don't know, like, why didn't I jump in my car and just zip off? What's wrong with me? And maybe that was the Spirit of God slowing you down, because there's a time for everything to happen. And it's not necessarily when our minds tell us it should happen. In John chapter 2, verse 4, Mary, Jesus' mother, came to him at the wedding. Says, hey, there's no wine. Jesus says to her, women, what does your concern have to do with me? It's not my wedding. He says, my hour has not yet come. So even though I understand there's a big emergency here, I can't reveal myself yet. There's a time that God wants me to reveal myself. So Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years long, but he didn't start doing miracles that anybody really could see out in public. The first 6 months, he didn't do that. He's just gathering his disciples. These people are believing him because of his word, not because they're seeing these incredible things happen. His disciple, he wanted to make sure he wasn't doing incredible things so that people were not following him because of the miracles. So he's building a team of people who are just believing his word. And so he's just like, I can't do this big miracle yet. So that's why he called a few people over and prays over the barrels where nobody could see him. And the guy takes the barrels in, and everybody goes, "Oh, good for you, groomsmen and the father of the bride, and you saved the best wine for last." And Jesus didn't take any credit for it because it wasn't time. God said that you can't do that in public. So Jesus did it in private because it was his mama. But the time has not yet come. There's a time for everything. In John chapter 7, verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee. So he'd this is after he had healed the guy who was paralytic and told him in the pool of Bethesda and told him to take up his bed and walk. And all the Pharisees got mad at him and wanted to kill him. He says, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, which is, again, in up north. For he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. Anyway, so now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. This is the thing that brought Jesus down for the final time in Jerusalem. And his brothers therefore said to him, "Hey, depart here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you're doing." You got people out there who want to see you. Now the disciples, his brothers, Jesus has 4 brothers. They're really his cousins, but this father adopted the 4 brothers. And 2 of them were part of Jesus' crew, Jude and James, who later wrote books in the New Testament. They were disciples of Jesus. And he had 2 other brothers who thought Jesus was out of his mind. Isn't that how life is? And so Jesus had relatives out. He was crazy, and relatives who loved him. So if Jesus had that, you know that you can't be shocked at your own situation. So his brothers are trying to entice him into going down there so he can get killed. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Then Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come. But your time is always ready." So I am going to go down there. He ended up going down there in the middle of the feast and showing himself in the middle of the feast. And he, in fact, he sent his disciples down, as we remember from earlier, and that whole big entourage, they went down. And then Jesus quietly went down through Samaria and ministered to people. And he showed up in the middle of the feast. But he says, like, I'm not supposed to be there at the beginning of the feast. My time is not yet come. And he's waiting for I can't do anything until God tells me to do it. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 says, "To everything there's a season and a time for every purpose under heaven." So there's a time. We always say God's will done in God's way. So Abraham was doing God's will by having a son, but it wasn't God's way. God didn't say do it through Hagar. So you can do God's will, but not do it God's way and end up with an Ishmael. But also has to be done in God's timing. And we want things now because we're impatient. And God says, if you wait until I do it, it'll be done. It'll be permanent. You'll enjoy it. It won't fade away. It'll be built on the rock instead of built on the sand. If you do it in your timing, it's going to fall apart because you want it now, but it's not. It won't have all the things it needs to last. So he says, there's a purpose why I'm having you do it now or doing it later or wait, or there's a purpose. For everything has a time and a purpose. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 7. He tells them, so sometimes we want Jesus to come right now. Because, why didn't he come in Isaiah chapter 54, verse 7 says, "For a mere moment I've forsaken you." And he actually hadn't forsaken them, but it felt like that to them. He says, "But with great mercies I will gather you." So it feels like, he abandoned me. He didn't answer my prayer. God's like, no, I'm right here. I've got a purpose, though, in what I'm about to do. So he says to his disciples, let's wait 2 days. And so they waited. The disciples think, yay, we're not going down to Judea. They were just trying to kill him. Then Jesus says, okay, let's go down to Judea. And the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, lately," I don't mean to overstep my bounds, but lately the Jews sought to stone you. And are you going there again? Now, they say this nicely. I just want to let you know that the Jews, so are you going there again? I don't know if you remember when Peter didn't like something that Jesus was doing, Peter would just tell him off. in Matthew 16:22, when Jesus says, I must go to the cross and be crucified, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. Let me tell you what. And we want to correct God and take him off to the side and say, Jesus, you did not do this correctly. I needed this to happen on this date and at this time and in this way. And I'm frustrated. And Peter wanted to tell Jesus, no, no, no. And so that's why I don't believe that Peter was there when this news came up, because Peter would have said something, and John especially would have pointed out. Peter said, no, we're not going, because John loved to point out when Peter put his foot in his mouth. Is his favorite thing. And some people are just your people that tweak you a certain way, and John was always amused by Peter. So I don't think Peter was there. Peter lived very near where Jesus was, where John baptized, because they all went to Peter's house a couple times. Peter might have gone home. He had a wife and family, so he might have gone home during this, been at home and not been there when this happened, which might be another reason why Mark didn't write about it, because Mark got the gospel from Peter. At the end of Peter's life, Peter told Mark everything, and that's why it's very interesting to read the gospel according to Mark, and to see what stories Peter said and how much Peter's the hero in those stories and how much he's not the hero in John's version. Anyway, John chapter 8, verse 58, Jesus has said to the Pharisees, most assuredly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Now, let's be clear. Jesus hid himself at that time. There was one time that Jesus walked right through the midst and they didn't see him. That's when the angels surrounded him. At this point, these people are crazy. And he actually hid himself. But they were about to, this is only John chapter 8. We're in John chapter 11. It wasn't that long ago that they said they were going to stone him. And then in John chapter 10, again, Jesus, verse 30, Jesus says, I and my Father are one. Then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. So it's like every 3 or 4 chapters, they're trying to kill him. So that's why they said very politely, Jesus, lately, they have tried to stone you. And so we're going to go back there. So Jesus answered and said, and he never gives them a direct answer because he wants to teach them a greater lesson that's bigger than that moment. He answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. And so their day started at 6, ended at 6. And so since there's 12 hours in the day, as long as there's light, you can do what you want. They did not have street lights. If you're my age, you don't like going out at night, even when there are street lights. People walking, and it's like, what are you doing out? And there's street lights everywhere. They didn't have street lights. So at 6 o'clock, they shut it down. And people didn't do, if you walk at night, you're going to stumble, which is clearly he's giving them like a literal, when it's day, they got up. By 6 o'clock, they were working. And they worked until that last light, the sun set, until the sun just finally went down over the horizons. So he says, as long as you see the light, you can keep working. He says, if anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of the world. He said a similar thing, again, with that, the blind man, right, when they asked him if he should be healed, he says in John chapter 9, verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no man can work. So he's saying, it's like 3 o'clock, it's 4 o'clock, it's not 6 o'clock yet. He could see that the time is drawing near, but as long as it's not 6 and the sun's gone down, I still have time. I got to keep doing what God told me to do. He says, but if one walks in the night, you will stumble because the light is not in him. And so when they came to get Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane in Luke chapter 22, verse 53, he says to them, the Roman guards and the chief priest, he's actually talking to them who led the Roman guards there. He says, when I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But now that it's night in the garden, you're trying to seize me. He says, but this is your hour. Nighttime is your hour. I'm working during the day, but you work at night. And the power of darkness. And he's not referring literally to the devil, like the power of darkness. He says the power of doing things at night. The thieves and robbers do things at night, in the secret, in the dark, when nobody can see them. And he's saying, I did everything in the light. I did it all in front of you so you could see the miracles. You're sneaking at it's midnight. We already had our supper. We're here in the garden. I'm praying because it's late. And that's when you're doing what you're doing so nobody can see what you're doing. You're stumbling because you're doing it in the night. That's why you're stumbling. If you were doing it during the day, you would see clearly what God wants you to see. So these things he said, back to verse 11 of John chapter 11. These things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Because they don't know why, like, why are we going back to Judea? And he's telling them, because our friend Lazarus is asleep. I'm going to wake him up. So this metaphor for sleep is really how God, it's not really metaphor. That's how God looks at it. He used this metaphor earlier in Matthew chapter 9. So they should have caught on to it because he had said it earlier. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 23, a particular ruler had brought Jesus to his house. This means a dignitary in the temple, not a Roman ruler. When Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing. So the child was already dead. They already had the musicians. They already had people crying. Again, they had professional wailers who would come and cry. And that it would help the family mourn. I know how to cry. I can really cry. Good. Bring me to your house, and my crying will help you cry and help you mourn and get it all out. So they would bring in the wailing women who just knew how to cry and mourn. I have a friend, Vicky, who is a professional laugher. She has the best laugh, and some friends of mine who make movies will have Vicky come and sit in the audience when the producers are looking at the movie, because she's going to laugh. She's got a great laugh, and her laugh is infectious. It makes everybody laugh. And so these were criers. They were professional criers, and they're going to help everybody cry. So the people are crying. So Jesus says to them in Matthew chapter 9, verse 24, make room. The girl is not dead, but sleeping. It says, and they ridiculed him because the woman had been dead. Yes. But when the crowd was put outside, because Jesus says, okay, get them out, he went and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. So he saw it as just sleep. The disciples should have recognized, but that's how God sees it. That's how God sees our death. It's just sleep. Oh no, and it's permanent. Guys, no, not permanent. I'm going to wake you from that. You're going to be eternally awake. That's just sleep in God's eyes. It's just a moment. And you know how when we're sleeping and you don't know, when you close your eyes for a second and you open them, you think it's only been 5 seconds, your eyes been closed. But your wife says, no, you missed that whole show. It's been an hour. You missed all of Star Trek. But you think, it's only been 2 seconds. That's what it's going to be like. We're going to close our eyes at that final Trump, and then we're going to think, it's only been 2 seconds. It could have been 100 years, could have been 1,000 years. To God, it's 2 seconds, right? So to him, it's just sleep that she's going to wake you from. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. That's not, if you're a Christian, you don't sorrow like that. In 1 Thessalonians 4:14, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who are sleeping in Jesus. So he's going to, when Jesus comes back, we all rise up and we're going to meet him in the air, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just sleep. It's just momentary. So he says that we don't mourn in the same way. We do mourn because we're going to miss the person. We miss them, their physical presence here, because their laughter, their jokes, their stories, their comfort. That's natural. But we don't mourn like those who have no hope, like people who, because part of our heart says, but we will see them again. We're eventually comforted with the thought, I'm going to see that person again. Because really, it's just sleep. As far as how God looks at it, it's just sleep. However, as the disciples said in verse 12, Lord, if he's asleep, he will get well. It's like, if that's all, why are we going back to Judea? If he's just asleep, what's the problem? However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Like, we're going to Lazarus just to wake Lazarus up? Let him sleep. They're trying to kill you. Verse 14, then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Read my lips. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? Okay. And I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to them. So it's really, this actually didn't happen for Mary and Martha. It happened for the disciples because they needed to see somebody raised from the dead. Because what were they about to believe in a few months? Their faith was going to be put to test that Jesus could rise from the dead. So they needed to have this experience. They needed to have it right before, because now they have to go out. They're the ones who spread the gospel. The reason we're here today is because these disciples went out and wrote these stories, went out and preached. They had to believe in life after death because it was going to affect hundreds of millions of people. And so Mary and Martha went through this trauma for 4 days in exchange for hundreds of millions of people's lives being changed by the good news and people understanding the resurrection. Then Thomas said, and I'm almost done, he who's called the twin. Didymus, your translation may say Didymus, but Didymus means the twin. He was a twin. Now, we don't know who was twin. Jesus named him the twin because he had a twin brother or because he had two personalities. He had doubt and yet loyalty. He had two things that were warring. I'm loyal to Jesus, because he does later say, okay, let's go, but we're all going to die. But I'm loyal to you, Jesus, but I doubt that anything's going to happen. He had like two, I'm so loyal to everything you're saying, but I'm a pessimist the whole time. And we know people like that, and they're in the church. I'm here every Sunday, but I don't believe anything's going to happen good. And so I think it's because he was double-minded. James 1, verse 5 says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally without reproach, and it'll be given to him. But let him ask in faith, not doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind, back and forth, right? You go back and forth. For let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. Not because God is mad at them. Can you imagine if the quarterback's trying to throw you the football and you run to one side, and then you run to the other side, then you run to the other side, and because you can't decide where the pass is going to end up. Or it's like, that meant you're never going to receive the football because you won't plant somewhere and believe. You keep going back and forth and back and forth. You know, you could be an outfielder in the baseball game. Do I catch it? Or are you going to catch it? Am I going to catch it? Or are you going to catch it? You're not going to. Neither one of you are going to get it, right? You've seen those collisions in the outfield. Being double-minded, you have to. So it's not like, well, I'm not going to give you nothing because you're double-minded. You can't receive. You're not in a position to receive because you never planted and believed. For he is a double-minded man, unstable in all ways. It says James chapter 1, verse 8. John chapter 14. Verse 3, here's just more information about Thomas. Jesus says to everybody, I go to prepare a place for you. I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know. But Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you're going. And how can we know the way? Like, what are you talking about? We don't know where you're going. That's Thomas. Like, I've been here with you all this time. And Jesus says, you've been here all this time and you still don't understand where I'm saying I'm going? But that's Thomas. I am loyal. Thomas is one of the most loyal people, but I don't believe a word of it. John chapter 20, verse 24. Now, Thomas, called the twin, Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we've seen the Lord. Now, I don't know where Thomas was. Why was everyone there and Thomas not there? That's already interesting. We've seen the Lord. So he said to them, well, unless I see in his hands the print of his nails and put my finger into the print of his nail, put my hands into his side, I'm not going to believe because that's who I am. I don't believe nothing. They're all saying, we saw Jesus. You think we're crazy making this up? Yes. Okay. But did Jesus not say he was going to rise from the dead? Yes, but I did not believe it. Still don't believe it. So that's Thomas. But I'm loyal. You see, I'm here. Isn't that good enough? No. It's not good enough that you're there if you're dragging everything down and you don't believe anything. I'm here to be the thorn in your side, but I'm loyal. You can't say I'm not loyal. That's true, but I can't say that I hate you. So he says to his fellow disciples, when Thomas says, let us go also that we may die with him. Here's where Thomas got that idea, like it's okay to go, even though Lazarus is dead, we'll go also, and then we'll all be dead. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, Nathan came to David to tell him his son had died. Nathan had been praying about his son. Lord, please raise my son, raise my son. And sometimes God is going to raise them on the other side. It's our duty to believe that the healing is now. The healing for sure is going to come when we get our new bodies. But we do have a down payment of it now. And God's not asking us to decide whether or not we get it now or not. If God comes to you and tells you, I'm going to heal you on the other side. Some people know that. They just have a peace. They know, I'm going to get healed on the other side. And they're good with that. And they'll just go, like, thanks, Jesus. Thanks. I'm going with him. But unless God comes to you and tells you that, we believe that we have it now. So, and that's what God asks us to do. Believe that you have all that stuff now. But the answer to the prayer may be, I'm going to heal you on the other side. We don't know. So David's praying for God to heal his son, and they come to him and said he's dead. And so David washes up, and he's about to go into the temple and praise the Lord. And they said, why are you praising the Lord now? And in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23 says, well, but now he's dead. Why should I fast? I was fasting before. Can I bring him back again? I'm going to go to him, but he won't return to me. But I'm going to him. So, God has spoken. I'm good with it. God's healed him. He's healed now on the other side. He's alive on the other side. I'm good with that. So I'm going to go to him to, help bury him, etc. And that's what Thomas is thinking Jesus is saying. Lazarus is dead. So let's go to him and bury him. But he's also thinking, and when we get there, they're all going to kill us. But I'm loyal. I'll follow you there. So that's why Jesus is calling him the twin. You have two minds. You are loyal to me. You're the first one here, but you think it's all going to fall apart. So I am stopping there. They're on their way to see Lazarus, of course. And we know these stories, but it's fun to really pick apart the sentences and see what's really, really going on, because we can always learn anything. We can learn a lot from it. So thank you again for listening. And thanks. I'm just saying hi to Sandy and Tammy and Jan and Rodney and all the people, and my sister and brother, and thank you all and Justin, who take time to write something. That's very kind of you. And there's 100 other people who do not do that, and thank you. You don't have to do that, and I still really appreciate that. I know you're tuning in and that you're listening. I will continue next week. On Sunday, I'm in the book of Exodus at 9 a.m. for my Sunday school class. And interesting things are happening there, too, with Moses as they've escaped the Egyptians. Right. Thank you again for listening. And wait, I'm trying to close these things. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.